I think it was the management. Yeah, it's not. There is a social responsibility, but there is also an employer's responsibility, and that employer's responsibility is as strong for the UN as it is for commercial media or for an NGO or anyone. We all have to be responsible for our people.
First and foremost with the governments to see that no journalists are killed.
Governments or armed groups, or in certain cases where there is no authority, obviously, but there has to be, I think there has to be a sort of a basic minimum responsibility of an employer when you're putting an employee in a dangerous situation. As head of Amnesty, every time I authorize a mission to a security situation, I have to make a risk assessment. We have to put in all sorts of security measures, have conversations with others on the ground to see whether it's safe or not. And that's regardless of whether the armed groups or the government is going to take responsibility or not. But the point I wanted to make was about embedding. Now, embedding, as far as Amnesty is not a media-oriented organization, but we do have lots and lots of contacts with media and journalists, and we do take action to protect them when they get into trouble. Now, all the journalists I've spoken to, none of them want to be embedded. It's not a matter of choice. Sometimes it's been a matter of control. If you're not embedded, you don't get access. If you're not embedded, you're not allowed to get there. And the whole issue of access is something else. In fact, if you look at the figures of the International Federation of Journalists, in 2007, 170 people, journalists were killed. In 2008, it was 109. And that wasn't because it was getting safer for journalists. It was because, in many cases, journalists were not allowed to get into conflict areas to do coverage. So access is also another issue there. Obviously, one should not risk journalists, but one should not restrict journalists from getting into news as well. So I was kind of thinking that this embedding, it endangers journalists. It restricts their access too, because if you're embedded, you're only allowed to see certain things.
Neil Gallagher, I was Director of Communications at the World Food Program for 5 years. And basically, I don't think any of you would be... I honestly don't think any of you would be in business at this point if it weren't for journalists. I know WFP wouldn't. Getting journalists into Niger and to Darfur and all the rest, this is how we raise money. So you have to live with them one way or another. But my question for you has to do with something else. How do you handle insurance? Are you self-insurers? Do you use private insurance? Do you have the same compensation mechanisms for international staff as you do for national staff?
Yeah, I'm willing to start. On the insurance question, we have international insurance provided for evacuation, for assistance in if there was a kidnapping situation. We have that through a self-insured international organization that our organization uses. In terms of national staff, a lot of the insurance organizations won't allow for you to insure the national staff locally, so we usually do a self-insure through our own mechanisms, and we're passing all of this, in many cases, along to the donors who are supporting us. So it's a combination of self-insurance and then also international insurance that we use. It actually depends on the country and sometimes even the laws of the country as to what the payout can be. So in many cases, we work in nearly 40 countries around the world. In some countries, it's actually limited by national law. So you have to go through all kinds of national labor law issues. So it varies. In the example that we have, I don't know how others are. Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Lucy Morgadowitz, and I actually worked as a freelance journalist and as an aid worker in Afghanistan. And I didn't actually have a security policy on either occasion. But what I was very interested in was what Irene was saying about the need for more openness between human rights organizations and between the humanitarian community. And I worked in Afghanistan during the Taliban regime, and I would just be interested to know your views on how you would achieve that. At the time, of course, there was a lot of relief being delivered to the country, but would you suggest the need to apply conditionality on aid receipts, that would have been a way of achieving that outcome, so that, for example, girls could have gone to school. Because I don't believe personally that would have worked during the Taliban. I think that they would have just kicked the organization out of the country. But my second point was more what happened after the intervention, after September 11th, which I'm writing a book on, and I was very involved in the country for 5 years from that time. You talked about impunity, and basically what I witnessed there, we all know that the warlords came back and were armed and given a lot of financing by principally the US. But since then there has been a culture of impunity, which is, I believe the international community has condoned effectively by not at the outset doing more to have some kind of a process of accountability or justice and reconciliation for past abuses. So that is, we now see the downstream effects, which are corruption, institutionalized criminality, chaos, basically, in the regions. Does the panel have views on what sort of process of accountability or indicting of some of these people we should have followed at the outset, so that we didn't have the situation, for example, where we have people like Shahrani, who headed up the Supreme Court, acted as a complete bloc fundamentalist on any sort of constitutional reform and blocked all judicial reform. Do people have comments or views on what we could have done differently at the outset of our intervention to have prevented this situation?
Would that have been part of the remit of the organizations working there?
Of course, the humanitarian organizations on the ground, but certainly from Amnesty's perspective, right from the beginning, we had raised all those issues. We had raised the issue of impunity at that time. We had proposed to the donors way back in 2002 to have some form of a vetting